Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in today. This is the Bodega Cat Book Club Financial Edition. And today we're continuing our reading of The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin. Its subtitle is called A Second Look at the Federal Reserve. So I wanted to read this book because I am big on fundamentals and studying and learning what is fundamentals in our lives. And although I believe that my Mother Nature is abundant and free, we are entangled in the money matrix, if you will, monetary matrix, right? Very deeply entrenched in it. And so I think it's good to understand how it works, its history, and things like that. So that's kind of the inspiration for reading this book. And I commend you guys for sticking with us so far. This is a very big book. It's about 600 some pages, and we're more than halfway through. So kudos to you. Kudos to you. All right. So anyway, since you're here, we have other book clubs. I just want to make a couple announcements. We have the spiritual book clubs on Mondays, and then Wednesdays we have health book clubs where we read about health, anything health related. And we have a monthly newsletter that we put out. So sign up for that. It's free. Um, Kind of that would keep us in touch with what's going on. I have things that are going on at the Bodega Cat podcast that I put out pretty regularly. So you can check us out there. There's a podcast tab on the website. So I interview interesting people. I think they're interesting anyways. And we talk about interesting topics. So check us out there. And I put out all my podcasts and books that we've read in the past on YouTube, so you could check out our YouTube channel. And if you have any books that you want the book club to read, I leave a link in the description box below, and you can recommend whether it's spiritual books or health books or financial books. We like to read classics. Classic books have been around for a while, and they have stood the test of time usually. Yeah, so we like that very much. And if you find this format helpful, if you find the book club helpful and things that we do helpful, you can buy me a coffee or check out our merch. And if you're local in the Los Angeles area, come visit us in person. We have a healing center that uses technologies based on Nikola Tesla's scalar wave research for holistic healing for both animals and human. So, and I concentrate on the cats because I have two cats and I love cats. That doesn't mean I don't love dogs. I love dogs too. They have their unique personalities and their unique mission in our life, in our spiritual journey. But cats are my thing. I'm a cat person. There, I said it. I'm a cat person. Okay. All right. So this episode is chapter 20, and we will be, this is part two. Chapter 20, part two. Okay. So let's do it. Let's see where I am. Okay. If you have a book, you could follow with us there. If not, you can follow with us here on the screen. And I'm just going to move the camera in a little bit so you guys can, oh, not that way, Christina. The other way so you guys can see here better. Okay. All right. All right, here we go. England faces a dilemma. At the end of World War I, Britain faced an economic dilemma. She had abandoned the gold standard early in the war in order to remove all limits from the creation of fiat money. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? Sounds like Nixon in 1972. And the result had been extreme inflation. But now she wanted to regain her former position of power and prestige in the world's financial markets and decided that to accomplish this, it would be necessary to return to the gold standard. It was decided further to set the exchange value of the pound sterling, the British monetary unit, at exactly $4.86 in US currency, which was approximately what it had been before the war began. To say that she wanted to return to the gold standard actually is misleading. It was not a pure standard in which every unit of money was totally backed by a stated weight of gold. Rather, it was a fractional gold standard. Oh my gosh. Fractional gold standard in which only a certain fraction of all the monetary units were so backed. But even that was much to be desired over no backing whatsoever for three reasons. First, it created greater consumer confidence in the money system because of the implied promise to redeem all currency in gold, even though such promises are always broken when based on a fractional reserve. There's a footnote about that. The government hedged even on this provision. Only bars of gold bullion were available for redemption, not coins. This ensured that gold would not circulate as money and that it would be used almost exclusively for large-scale international transactions. They always find a way to manipulate and I don't know what the word I want. Um, what's the word I want? They always find a way to manipulate and wiggle and fraud you out, right? Fraud the people out. Sorry. It's too early for me to talk or to think. Okay. Anyways, I hope you know what I mean. Okay. Um, where am I? Okay, secondly, it provided an efficient means of settling financial accounts between nations, gold always being the international medium of choice. Thirdly, it applied some braking action to the production of fiat money, thus providing a certain degree of restraint to inflation and the boom bust cycle. The decision to return to a fractional gold standard, therefore, while it left much to be desired, was still a step in the right direction. But there were two serious problems with the plan. The first was that the exchange value of gold can never be decided by political decree. It will always be determined by the interplay of supply and demand within the marketplace. Trying to fix the number of dollars which people will be willing to exchange for a pound sterling was like trying to legislate how many baseball cards a schoolboy will give for a purple agate. The international currency market is like a huge auction. If the auctioneer sets the opening bid too high, there will be no takers, which is exactly what happened to the pound. The other problem was that during the war, England had adopted a massive welfare program and a strong network of labor unions. The reason this was a problem was that the only way to make the pound acceptable in international trade was to allow its value to drop to a competitive and realistic level. And that would have meant not only a drastic reduction in welfare benefits, but also a general lowering of prices, including the price of labor, which is called wages. That also means people have to get off the butt and go to work. Politicians were quite willing to, just a little side note there. All right, politicians were quite willing to allow prices of commodities to move downward, but they did not have the courage to take any action which would reduce either welfare benefits or wages. To the contrary, they continued to bid for votes with promises of still more socialism and easy credit. Prices continued to rise. England and depression. With the value of the pound set artificially high in order to sustain prices, wages, and profit levels, the cost of British exports also became high and they ceased to be competitive in world markets. With exports in decline, the amount of money coming into the country also declined. England became a debtor nation, which means that her payments to other countries were larger than her income from those countries. As pointed out in Chapter 5, if an individual spends more than his income, he must either increase his income, dip into savings, sell off assets, create counterfeits, or borrow. Yeah, I've done all that. The same is true of nations. England had already borrowed to the limit of her credit and was rapidly exhausting her savings in order to continue purchasing foreign goods to sustain the high standard of living to which she had grown accustomed. She couldn't counterfeit because payments of these for these imports had to be settled in gold, which meant that as her national savings were spent, her gold supply moved out of the country. The handwriting was on the wall. If this process continued, the nation soon would be broke. It was a situation, incidentally, which was amazingly parallel to what has plagued the United States since the end of World War II, and for mostly the same reasons. By March of 1919, England's trade was so depressed that she had no choice but to let the value of the pound float, which means to seek its own level in response to supply and demand. Within a year, it had dropped to $3.21, a loss of 34%. Since the American dollar was the de facto world monetary standard at the time, receiving fewer dollars for each pound sterling meant that the pound was valued lower in all the markets of the world. The result was that the price Britishers had to pay for imported goods was becoming higher, while the price she received for the export of her own goods was becoming lower. The British economy was not only badly anemic, it was experiencing a monetary hangover from the vast inflation of World War I. In other words, it was undergoing a painful, but in the long run, healthy recovery and a return to reality. Such a condition was intolerable to the monetary and political scientists who were determined to find a quick and painless remedy which would allow the binge to continue. Several emergency therapies were administered. The first was to use the Financial Committee of the League of Nations, which England dominated, to require all the other European nations to follow similar inflationary monetary policies. They were also required to establish what was called the quote gold exchange standard, a scheme whereby all countries base their currency not on gold but on the pound sterling. In that way, they could all inflate together without causing a disruptive flow of gold from one to the other, and England would act as the regulator and guarantor of the system. In other words, England used the power of her position within the League of Nations to establish the Bank of England as a master central bank for all the other central banks of Europe. It was the prototype for what the cabal now is doing with Federal Reserve and the World Bank within the framework of the United Nations. Problem of American prosperity. Europe was well in hand, but that still left the United States to be controlled. America had also inflated during the war, but not nearly as much. She also had a fractional gold standard, but the stockpile of gold was very large and still growing. As long as America continued to exist as the producer of so many commodities that England needed for import, and as long as the value of the dollar continued to be high, the anemia of the pound sterling would continue. There's a footnote about that. For an overview of the foregoing developments, see the Federal Reserve as a cartelization device. Interesting word. By Mary Ann Rothbard in Money in Crisis, Barry N. Siegel, editor, New York Bollinger, 1984, page 113 to 117. The therapy chosen for this problem was simple. Perform a monetary transfusion from a healthy patient to the unhealthy one. All the London financiers had to do was find a large and robust specimen who, without asking too many questions, would be willing to become the donor. The specimen selected, of course, was Uncle Sam himself. It was the prototype of the transfer mechanism previously described, which has been the life support keeping alive the moribund communist and socialist countries since World War II. There were several ways the lifeblood of one nation can be transfused to another. The most direct method, of course, is to make an outright gift, such as the bizarre American ritual called foreign aid. Interesting, eh? Like USAID. Wow, that's interesting. Another is to make a gift disguised as something else, such as needlessly stationing military bases abroad for the sole purpose of bolstering the foreign economy or granting loan to a foreign government at below market rates or worse, with the full expectation that the loan will never be repaid. They did that to the countries in Africa. That's why the countries in Africa are so poor. In my opinion, just a side note, I think Africa is the richest country in the world. In my opinion, it's very rich in resources and rich in history. Uh, but it's very sad. It's been suppressed and oppressed. Um, Okay, but the third way is the most ingenious of them all. To have one nation deliberately inflate its currency at a rate greater than the other nation so that the real purchasing power in terms of international trade moves from the more inflating to the less inflating nation. This is a method truly worthy of the monetary scientist. It is so subtle and so sophisticated that not one in 1,000 would even think of it, much less object to it. It was, therefore, the ideal method chosen in 1925 to benefit England at the expense of America. Just a side note, I have to say, these people are creative in a very wicked kind of way. They really think of ways that are kind of very twisted. Ugh. But it kind of creative. Wow. Well, you got to give them credit for that. They're not creators, but they take ideas and kind of twisted it around and bastardized it and all that stuff. And wow, what a weird world we live in. It's a bizarro world, like they say, huh? As Professor Rothbard observed, in short, the American public was nominated to suffer the burdens of inflation and subsequent collapse, the crash of 1929, in order to maintain the British government and the British trade union movement in the style to which they insisted on becoming accustomed. And that quote was from Rothbard, Crisis, page 131 to 132. At the inception of the Federal Reserve System, there had been a brief struggle for power, but within a few years, the contest was decisively won by the head of the New York Bank, Benjamin Strong. Strong, it will be recalled, previously had been head of Morgan Bankers Trust Company and was one of the 7 participants at the secret meeting on Jekyll Island. Professor Quigley reminds us that, quote, Strong owed his career to the favor of the Morgan Bank. He became governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York as the joint nominee of Morgan and Kuhn, Loeb and Company. That quote was from Quigley, Tragedy, page 326. It's interesting title, Governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Sounds like the nation, right? Or a city, a governor, or a state, like politics. Okay, Strong was the ideal choice for the cartel. Not the least of his qualifications was his alliance with the financial powers of London. When Montague Norman was made the governor of the Bank of England in 1920, there began a close personal relationship between the two central bankers, which lasted until Strong's sudden death in 1928. Norman was considered by many to be eccentric, if not mentally unbalanced. Quigley says, Norman was a strange man whose mental outlook was one of successfully suppressed hysteria or even paranoia. He had no use for government and feared democracy. Both of these seemed to him to be threats to private banking, and thus to all that was proper and precious in human life. When he rebuilt the Bank of England, he constructed it as a fortress prepared to defend itself against any popular revolt. With the sacred gold reserves hidden in deep vaults below the level of underground waters, which could be released to cover them by pressing a button on the governor's desk. For much of his life, Norman rushed about the world by fast steamship, covering tens of thousands of miles each year, often traveling incognito, concealed by a black slouch hat and a long black coat under the assumed name of Professor Skinner. Norman had a devoted colleague in Benjamin Strong. In the 1920s, they were determined to use the financial power of Britain and of the United States to force all the major countries of the world to go on the gold standard with the artificial value set for the benefit of England, and to operate it through central banks free from all political control, with all questions of international finance to be settled by agreements by such central banks without interference from governments. Uh, and that quote was from Quigley, Tragedy, page 326. Oh, sorry about all the flip-flop back and forth. Trying to get the book kind of uh, aligned here. Strong and Norman spent many holidays together, sometimes in Bar Harbor, Maine, but usually in southern France. And they crisscrossed the Atlantic on numerous other occasions to consult with each other on their plan for controlling the world economy. Lester Chandler tells us, quote, their associations were so frequent and prolonged, and their collaborations so close, that it is still impossible to determine accurately their relative roles in developing some of the ideas and projects that they share. And that quote was from Lester V. Chandler, Benjamin Strong Central Banker, Washington, D.C., Brookings Institute, 1958, reprinted by Arnold Press, a New York Times Company, 1978, page 259. The Bank of England provided Strong with an office and a private secretary during his visits, and the two men kept in close contact with each other through the weekly exchange of private cables. All of these meetings and communiques were kept in strict secrecy. When their frequent visits drew inquiries from the press, the standard reply was that they were just friends getting together for recreation or informal chats. By 1926, the heads of the central banks of France and Germany were occasionally included in their meetings, which, according to Norman's biographer, were, quote, more secret than any ever held by royal archmasons or by any Rosicrucian order. And that quote was from John Hargrave, Montague Norman, New York Greystone Press, 1942, page 108. Secret meeting of 1927. The culmination of these discussions took place at a secret meeting in 1927, at which it was agreed that the financial lifeblood of the American people would be donated for a massive transfusion to Great Britain. Galbraith sets the scene. On July 1st, 1927, the Mauretania arrived in New York with two notable passengers, Montague Norman, governor of the Bank of England, and Hjalmar what? Shock, Shock. Oh, sorry, butchered that name for sure. Sorry. Anyways, he's German. We know that. Head of the German Reichsbank. The secrecy covering the visit was extreme and to a degree ostentatious. The names of neither of the great bankers appeared on the passenger list. Neither, on arriving, met with the press. In New York, the two men were joined by Charles Rist, the deputy governor of the Banque de France, and they went into conference with Benjamin Strong, the governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. The principal, or in any case, the ultimately important what's that? Oh, that's interesting. Was that a missing word there? Or a print typo? Anyways, discussion was a persistently weak reserve position of the Bank of England. Thus, the bankers thought could be helped if the Federal Reserve System would ease interest rates, encouraging lending. Holders of gold would then seek the high returns from keeping their metal in London. And in time, higher prices in the United States would ease the competitive position of British industry and labor. And that was from Galbraith, page 174 and 1 to 175. Galbraith speaks with soft phrases to cushion a harsh reality. What he is saying is that the purpose of the meeting was to finalize a plan whereby the governor of the Federal Reserve System was to deliberately create inflation in the US so that American prices would rise, making US goods less competitive in world markets and causing American gold to move to the Bank of England. Governor Strong needed a little convincing. That is precisely what he and Norman had planned to do all along. And in fact, he had already begun to implement the plan. The purpose of inviting the Germans and the French to the meeting was to enlist their agreement to create inflation in their countries as well. Oh, okay, that's the German guy again. Schoch, Schacht. Shocked. Oh, sorry. And Rist would have no part of it. That's a German banker, and left the meeting early, leaving Strong and Norman to work out the final details between them. Strong was more concerned about British fortunes than American. In a letter written in May of 1924 to the Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon, he discussed the necessity of lowering American interest rates as a step toward money expansion with the objective of raising American prices relative to those in Great Britain. He acknowledged that the goal was to protect England from having to cut back on wages, profits, and welfare. He said, at the present time, it is probably true that British prices for goods internationally dealt in are, as a whole, roughly in the neighborhood of 10% above our prices. And one of the preliminaries to the reestablishment of gold payment by Great Britain will be to facilitate a gradual readjustment of these price levels before monetary reform is undertaken. In other words, this means some small advance in prices here and possibly some small decline in their prices. The burden of this readjustment must fall largely upon us than upon them. It will be difficult politically and socially for the British government and the Bank of England to face a price liquidation in England in face of the fact that trade is poor and they have over 1 million unemployed people receiving government aid. And that quote was from Chandler, page 282 to 284. Bringing down the dollar. The Mandrake mechanism of the Federal Reserve went into high gear on behalf of the Bank of England in 1924, several years before the historic meeting between Strong, Norman, and Rist. There were two great surges of monetary expansion. The first came with the monetization of $492 million in bonds, plus almost twice as much in bankers' acceptances. The second burst of inflation came in the latter half of 1927, immediately following the secret meeting between Strong, Norman, Schoch, the German guy, and Rist. Schacht, Schoch, the German guy. It involved the funding of $225 million in government bonds plus $220 million in bankers' acceptances for a total increase in bank reserves of $445 million. At the same time, the rediscount rate to member banks, the interest rate they pay to borrow from the Fed was lowered from 4 to 3.5%, making it easier for those banks to acquire additional reserves, out of which they could create even more fiat dollars. The amount created on top of that by the commercial banks is about 5.5 times the amount created by the Fed, which means a total money flood in excess of $10 billion in just 6 years. There's a footnote about that. Approximately, oh, okay, let's see here. I think that's 1 billion, $1,328,000,000. In the first bust, including both bonds and acceptances, plus $445 million in the second bust equals $1,773,000,000. This amount multiplied by 5.5 equals $9,751,500,000. Wow. At the original $1,773,000,000, used as a base, and the total is 11,524,500,000. This estimate is reasonably close to the figure of $10,661,000,000 published by the Fed itself, which represents the growth in total deposits and currency in circulation during the period. See deposits and currency, page 34. Wow, that's a lot of zeros. It's easy to get lost in the zeros, isn't it? Okay, throughout this period, the demand by the system for government bonds and acceptances pushed interest rates down. There's a footnote about that. When an item is in demand, its price goes up. In the case of bonds and other interest-bearing debt instruments, the price is expressed in reverse of its interest yield. The higher the price, the lower the interest. In other words, the higher the price, the more one has to pay to obtain the same dollar amount in interest. Therefore, when the Fed creates an artificial demand for bonds or commercial paper, such as acceptances, the interest yield on these items go down, which makes them more costly as an investment. As anticipated, people with gold then preferred to send it to London, where it could earn a higher yield, and America's gold supply began to move abroad. Furthermore, as inflation began to eat its way into the purchasing power of the dollar, the prices of American-made goods began to rise in world markets, making them less competitive. U.S. exports began to decline. Unemployment began to rise. Low interest rates and easy credit led to speculation in the securities markets, and the system lunged full speed ahead toward the great crash of 1929. But that part of the story must wait for another chapter. The technician who actually drafted the final version of the Federal Reserve Act was H. Parker Willis. After the system was created, he was appointed as first secretary of the Board of Governors. By 1929, he had become disillusioned with the cartel, and in an article published in the North American Review, he wrote, in the autumn of 1926, a group of bankers, among whom was one with the world-famous name, were sitting at a table in a Washington hotel. One of them raised the question whether the low discount rates of the system were not likely to encourage speculation. Yes, replied the conspicuous figure referred to, they will, but that cannot be helped. It is the price we must pay for helping Europe. And that quote was from The Failure of the Federal Reserve by H. Parker Willis, the North American Review, May 1929, page 553. There can be little doubt that the banker in question was J.P. Jack Morgan Jr. It was Jack who was imbued with English tradition from the earliest age, whose financial empire had its roots in London, whose family business was saved by the Bank of England, who spent 6 months out of every year of his later life as a resident of England, who had openly insisted that his junior partners demonstrate a loyalty to Britain. That was from Chernow. The quote, that loyalty to Britain quote was from Chernow, page 167. And who had directed the Council on Foreign Relations, the American branch of the secret society dedicated to the supremacy of British tradition and political power. It is only with that background that one can fully appreciate the willingness to sacrifice American interests. Indeed, quote, it is the price we must pay for helping Europe, end quote. In spite of the growing signs of crisis in the American economy, Morgan's protege, Benjamin Strong, was nonetheless pleased with his accomplishment. In a letter written in 1929 to Parker Gilbert, who was the American agent for reparations, he said, our policy of the last 4 years up to this January has been effective in accomplishing the purpose for which it was designed. It has enabled monetary reorganization to be completed in Europe, which otherwise would have been impossible. It was undertaken with a well-organized hazard that we were Sorry. It was undertaken with the well-organized, okay, Christina, a tongue twister there. Okay, let's try again. It was undertaken with the well-recognized hazard that we were liable to encounter a big speculation and some expansion of credit. Our course was perfectly obvious. We had to undertake it. The conditions permitted it, and the possibility of damage abroad was at a minimum. Boy, that was a tongue twister. And that quote was from Chandler's page 458. For additional clarification, also see page 459 to 463. Damage abroad. What about damage at home? It is clear that Strong saw little difference between the two. He was the forerunner of the internationalists who have operated the Federal Reserve ever since. He viewed the United States as but one piece in a complex world financial structure, and what was good for the world was good for America. And oh yes, what was good for England was good for the world. The British American Union, excuse me. It is one of the least understood realities of modern history that many of America's most prominent political and financial figures, excuse me, then as now, have been willing to sacrifice the best interests of the United States in order to further their goal of creating a one world government. The strategy has remained unchanged since the formation of Cecil Rhodes Society and its offspring, the Round Table groups. It is to merge the English-speaking nations into a single political entity, while at the same time creating similar groupings for other geopolitical regions. After this is accomplished, all of these groupings are to be amalgamated into a global government, the so-called Parliament of Man. And guess who is planning to control that government from behind the scenes? This strategy was expressed aptly by Andrew Carnegie, or Carnegie, some people pronounce it that way, in his book Triumphant Democracy. Expressing concern that England was in decline as a world power, he said, reunion with her American children is the only sure way to prevent continued decline. Whatever obstructs reunion, I oppose. Whatever promotes reunion, I favor. I judge all political questions from this standpoint. The Parliament of Man and the Federation of the World have already been held by the prophet, been held by the poet, and these mean a step much farther in advance of the proposed reunion of Britain and America. I say that as surely as the sun in the heavens once shone upon Britain and America united, so surely is it one morning to rise, shine upon, and greet again the reunited state, the British American Union. And that quote was from Andrew Carnegie, or Carnegie, Triumphant Democracy, New York, Charles Scribner's Sons, 1893, page 530 to 549. This is a revised edition of the book, which was originally written in 1886. Earlier editions do not contain these words. All right, summary. After the Civil War, America experienced a series of expansions and contradictions of the money supply, leading directly to economic booms and busts. This was the result of the creation of fiat money by a banking system, which, far from being free and competitive, was a halfway house to central banking. Throughout the chaos, one banking firm, the House of Morgan, was able to prosper out of the failure of others. Morgan had close ties with the financial structure and culture of England and was, in fact, more British than American. Even events suggest the possibility that Morgan and Company was in concealed partnership with the House of Rothschild throughout the most of this period. Benjamin Strong was a Morgan man and was appointed as the first governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, which rapidly assumed dominance over the system. Strong immediately entered into close alliance with Montague Norman, governor of the Bank of England, to save the English economy from depression. This was accomplished by deliberately creating inflation in the US, which caused an outflow of gold, a loss of foreign markets, unemployment, and speculation in the stock market, all of which were factors that propelled America into the crash of 1929 and the Great Depression of the 30s. Although not covered in this chapter, it must be remembered that the same forces were responsible for American involvement in both world wars to provide the economic and military resources England needed to survive. Furthermore, the key players in this action were men who were part of the network of a secret society established by Cecil Rhodes for the expansion of the British Empire. End of chapter 20. Wow. This history is very interesting. It's almost as good as a James Bond movie or Mission Impossible movie. Anyways, all right. I hope you enjoyed that. And we will continue our reading next week of The Creature from Jekyll Island. In the meantime, I hope you guys all have a great day, great night, great week, wherever you guys are. And like I said in the beginning of the video, check out our many different things that we're doing. Check out our website, sign up for our newsletters. And we'll see you next time. Okay, bye-bye now.